This morning we are combining two lessons like we pointed out last week in anticipation of our meeting coming up where we'll have a break from this study. So since last week, this week's lesson and next week's lesson are all based on different aspects of the Apostle Peter, I figured this would be the best place for us to combine two lessons so we don't miss one of them, or do our best to get through both of them, or most of these two lessons. Lesson 6 is looking at Peter's bolder side, and then lesson 7, Peter's kind of the exact opposite of that side. So last week we saw Peter as a fisherman in that stage of his life. So today we'll start in lesson 6 in Matthew 14, looking at Peter's boldness, his courage, if we want to call it that. Boldness and courage don't always necessarily go together. They do sometimes, but not necessarily. And in Peter's case, sometimes it did, and sometimes it didn't. Sometimes it came out as in a courageous way. Other times it wasn't so much courage as just maybe hastiness. Faith, though, is what we're going to see focused as a focus in the life of Peter. Really in all three of the lessons about Peter, but today especially. In Hebrews 11, verse 1, the author describes faith as the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. So according to that definition, people demonstrate faith when they properly respond to the substance, the word he uses there, and the evidence that's available to them. And as such, faith is certainly more than just believing something in your head, in your mind. It's more than mental assent to something. But faith is belief in action. Romans 10:17, faith comes from hearing, and hearing through the word of Christ. It's a trusting response. Biblical faith is a trusting response to God's word. So there are always three things involved. God speaks, man hears, and then man obeys. That is faith. That's what belief is. That's what faith is. And it's a necessary part of salvation. Faith is. And I know of very few people that would find that controversial, other than full 5-point Calvinism. Faith is a part. I guess they may say that faith is a part of salvation. It's just not something you do. God puts it in you if He wants to. But because we are all sons of God through faith in Christ Jesus, as Paul said in Galatians 3:26, faith is required to become one of God's children in the first place and to remain one of God's children. And because Jesus is the author of eternal salvation to all who obey Him, Hebrews 5:9, then obviously obedience is something that has to take place. So rather than presenting alternate solutions to salvation, those two passages actually complement each other. They're not saying two different things. They're saying the same thing, or at least two different aspects of the same thing. We respond in faith when we hear and obey God's plan, His revelation. And that includes being baptized into Christ to put on Christ, Galatians 3:27. Hebrews 11:6 says, without faith it's impossible to be well-pleasing to Him. For he who comes to God must believe that He is, and that He is a rewarder of them that diligently seek Him. So our lesson text here this morning, our first text, Matthew 14, verses 22 through 33, records a very remarkable act of faith. What does all this have to do with Peter? Because we're about to see a visual illustration, not even just a visual illustration, an actual illustration of what faith is in his life. It was an occasion when he and the other disciples were on the Sea of Galilee. And we'll set up the stage here as we see. After Jesus fed the 5,000 by the shore there of the Sea of Galilee, in verses 13 through 21 of chapter 14, he made the disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side while he dismissed the crowd. So he's just fed the five, he just taught them, he just fed them, and now it's time to start wrapping things up, he decides. So he says, you guys go on ahead, get in the boat, go on. And what he's going to do is start dismissing the crowds, get them to start going home. And in John's account, we're told that this was the occasion when the crowd intended to come and take him by force and make him king. And so to keep that from happening, Jesus told the disciples to leave and told the crowd to leave. So that was the reason that he felt that was the best thing to do at this time, and I think we can understand why that was wise for him to even tell the disciples to leave, because even they may have gotten caught up in that movement to try to crown him as king right there on the spot by force. So when we think about that and we add to that his original intention of going to a place to pray by himself, or to go off to a place by himself before he healed them, it's no wonder that he immediately sent everybody away after he fed them, because that was his original idea in the first place. And what he did was he prayed. So the disciples are out on the boat in the middle of the Sea of Galilee, as instructed. Jesus has now separated himself from the crowds by telling them to leave, and now he is going to go stay up on this mountain, or go up on this mountain and pray by himself. That's verse 23. One of the many occasions when Jesus went off to pray by himself. He withdrew into the wilderness many times, Luke 5:16, to pray. So after he finished that period of prayer and private devotion, he decided he's going to go rejoin the disciples in the boat, which by this time, we're told, was a long way from the land, verse 24. A long way from the land, beaten by the waves, for the wind was against them. So the boat was a long way from the land, and it's being beaten by the waves because the wind was against them. It wasn't unusual for storms, pretty strong storms, to suddenly rise up over the Sea of Galilee. And I'm sure they had dealt with it many times in their adult lives and their professional lives, being fishermen that fished primarily, if not exclusively, on the Sea of Galilee, probably exclusively. But it says, verse 25, in the fourth watch of the night, he got to them. And it says that he got to them by walking on the sea. Okay? Fourth watch of the night would have been between 3 and 6 a.m. He comes to them. Was it between 3 and 6 a.m. because it took him that long to get to them? Probably not. Probably because it took him that long to get done praying. And now he goes and comes to them walking on the sea. That's verse 25. And that really sets up what's about to happen. Now, what makes it important is the description of the boat and the surroundings. The beaten by the waves, or some versions say it was being tossed or battered by the waves. It makes me sick just reading the words, honestly, because I don't care if I'm on a boat and it's barely rocking, I'm going to be green in the face and lose about 20 pounds of vomit. I'll go ahead and tell you, and it would not stop. So They probably weren't dealing with that because they were used to this kind of thing. But it's still not going to be the best time you've ever had dealing with this in the middle of the night. The wind is against you. If the wind is strong enough, even when you're walking on the ground, it makes a difference. You can tell you're having to work a little harder to walk when the wind is blowing directly against you, as opposed to behind you. It's almost like lifting you off. So on a boat, it would be multiplied, immeasurably how difficult this is. We're trying to get to where we need to get, and the wind is really giving us a hard time. So they clearly were struggling because they were still out there even this late. And now is when Jesus arrives. And we're told in verse 26 that how the disciples reacted to this. It says, when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, "It's a ghost." And they cried out in fear. So these were men that weren't necessarily all torn apart and crying out with fear because of the storm and the waves and the boat being treated the way that it was by the waves. But they weren't like in the figure, the man-shaped figure out there on the water. And who can blame them? Because I wouldn't like that either. And they didn't know who it was or what it was. They thought it was a ghost, a spirit of some kind. They've been watching too many scary movies, apparently, because that was the first thing they thought of. Well, something like that. But immediately it says Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." So, it's just me. Don't worry. Don't be afraid. It's me. And again, this is just about to set up what Peter is about to do. Dean, do you have something? Yeah.
Okay, now they're out there close to the middle of the Sea of Galilee, and they know that there's no way that could be Jesus to get, maybe they thought it was, and that's why they became afraid, realizing that they knew that couldn't be Jesus.
Yeah.
Because of the fact that they left him behind, way behind.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it can't be him, so who is it? What is it? It can't be anybody because they're out on the water. So, and there's probably a lesson in that of how our preconceived ideas can cloud our minds from understanding something. Like they didn't have a whole lot of time to ask questions. They just were told to get in the boat and go, so they went. But they're naturally they're gonna be thinking about him, how they're gonna get back with him, and naturally they'd seen some of the things he could do, so they may have thought, well, there's probably a good chance he's going to be there when we get there. I can't help but think that's, if they thought about it at all, which I can't imagine I'm not thinking about it, that's probably the main thing they were considering would happen. Or maybe they thought he's just going to walk around the long way and maybe meet up with us tomorrow or something. So that will be the natural explanation. He's just going to walk on foot. The other would have been, well, he may just be there on the shore when we get there. But the one thing they did not think he would have done is come out and walk to them on the water, because why would they think that? They had seen him feed 5,000 people with just a few small fish and some loaves, but they had never seen him walk on water. So it's not just as simple as, well, we know that he can do these amazing things, and therefore he can do this thing. And we have to understand, if we were in their position, that we would understand it a little better, that just because I know Jesus can do that doesn't mean that I think He's going to do this. So, for one thing, especially when it's not necessary, it was not necessary for Jesus to come out to them on the boat, to the boat. He could have done one of the things we just said, but He chose to do this for His own reasons and purposes. And so they were scared to death because they weren't thinking that Jesus was going to do that. Because, like Dean said, it can't be Jesus because Jesus is over yonder. Yeah, and it's 3 in the morning and they've been fighting the wind and the waves. I'm surprised they're thinking at all at this point, they're probably exhausted. We don't know what time He told the crowds to leave, but, there's no way that He was feeding them, in the middle of the night, So He had been praying all night long, and they had been fighting the waves and the wind all night long, and now they are crying out in fear. They're terrified, so much that they cried out in fear. It would probably take quite a bit to have a boat full of grown men crying out in fear. Maybe that's a Western way of thinking, but you could have a group of men that are terrified, but they're not necessarily going to cry out in fear. But whenever they're all crying out in fear, they were very, very scared. Terrified is a good word. Again, because they did not expect that to happen. So, yes. Mm-hmm.
Saying it's a ghost. What did that, all them men on that boat at that point in time was a ghost by their definition. Not the Western definition. If you ask everybody in this room, they might say, I don't know what I'd say.
Yeah.
Who I think a ghost is. What do you think a ghost was?
I think probably close enough that, a spirit, it's some sort of being, not a normal man, obviously, because that was the whole point. It can't be, not only can it not be Jesus, it can't be a person because people don't walk on water. So, yeah, they thought, and we have to remember, they thought the same thing later after Jesus rose from the dead, and Jesus had to show that, look, He said, look, it's me, it's me. They thought they were seeing a spirit again, a ghost or something. And He said, look, a spirit doesn't have flesh and bones like I have. So I think their idea of a ghost in this sense, ESV says ghost, your Bible may say something different, apparition or phantom or spirit, but I think, for all intents and purposes, it's pretty much close enough to what we would think is a ghost, what people that believe in ghosts. There's really no such thing as a ghost, by the way, at least not on earth. There's such things as spirits, but they don't go around doing things outside of their bodies, the bodies that they would have come from. There is a place for the spirits of the deceased, and it's not on earth. But good question, because, and again, there are some people over here that may think that kind of thing, but it probably isn't as common as it would have been over there. Their idea of a spirit or a ghost would have been more common in that time and in that part of the world than it is over here today. But still, as for what it is, it's pretty close to the same thing. General idea of a ghost. Another lesson there, though, is that Jesus immediately speaks and comforts them. So there's a lesson right there in itself as well. Don't be afraid, it's me. Now, this is where Peter comes in. Peter answered him, verse 28, Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water. We'll cut Peter a little bit of slack here with the if it is you. Jesus seems to have cut him some slack on that, so I will too. Because, there was a time when a man said, if you can do this, and Jesus said, oh, if I can, really? He didn't do that to Peter here, so I don't think that's the kind of thing that Peter meant. He's just saying, command me to come out on the water. Mm-hmm.
Well, did he say that when he told him to throw the net over the, like I said? Like you told him to.
Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of the same attitude here. It's, all right, tell me to come out, and I will.
And we assume he's kind of far away from them still, where they can't really, see his face either.
Yeah, and there's a storm going on, and it's the middle of the night. And, since it's a storm, it's also any light that could possibly be provided is going to be blocked by clouds and whatever else. So the point is, Peter says, if it's you, command me to come to you on the water. And he says, come.
You don't really think that by him saying if, it was a test?
Not a test in the sense of doubting Jesus. Maybe a test in the sense of testing this ghost. Yeah. But not in the sense of testing Jesus. The whole point was to test if it really is Jesus, which may sound like a strange test in these circumstances, but be that as it may, that's what he did. That was his test. And he said, all right, come on. And this is where we see Peter's faith. It says Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus. Mission success is what that would be. Test, check mark on the test. It's really Jesus. He would have known as soon as he set one foot that it was Jesus. He didn't have to get out there and get closer to Jesus and think, oh, it really is you. I can see you now. Because obviously, the fact that he did this. And the reason we need to give Peter all the respect that he deserves in this case is that he actually did this. I wouldn't have done that. I'll go ahead and tell you. At least I would have had to have the people push me out. Yeah, we're not talking. It will be enough if it was calm waters, but we're talking about a storm, in the middle of a storm. And Peter, just the very idea, the words, he got out of the boat. What kind of crazy person would get out of a boat in the middle of a storm? Well, Peter did. And he put his foot on the water. I have no idea what it felt like. I've never walked on water before. I don't know how that works because it's not natural. Supernatural. That's the whole point. But he did give him all the credit he deserves for verse 29. He got out of the boat, he walked on the water, and he walked all the way to Jesus. Don't know how far Jesus was. Far enough for them to not know it was him. He walked to Jesus. But this is when it takes a little turn. And maybe the biggest focus, unfairly to Peter. It says, but when he saw the wind, he was afraid.
Maybe like the storm picked up.
Maybe. Yes.
Not a person is to say what I brought up last week. Maybe Jesus said to him, you know, Peter, you're terrible slow to learn. We've been through all of this in the past. There's just a little bit of difference here. Now it's walk on the water as opposed to what we did last time. And I said, it's me. So if it was me and you learned your lesson last time, why are you so slow to learn? We'll a little later see.
I think,
That just doesn't, because of see it in the West at this point in time in history. That didn't, you see, that didn't occur to nobody but me. But Peter is just slow to learn.
Well, they were all slow to learn. Jesus called them out for that, at times. But in this case, again, he went out there and did it immediately. I mean, that's all it took. The problem that he had, though, was after he had already done it, he seems to have, he sort of snapped out of it, whatever he was in. And he realized, I'm standing out here on the water. It's like Wile E. Coyote. You remember Wile E. Coyote? And sometimes he chased Roadrunner off a cliff, and he didn't fall until he realized he was out there walking on nothing. I can't count how many times that happened. They ran out of ideas, I guess. So there he goes, and he's just sitting there running on nothing because he went off the cliff, but then all of a sudden he looks down, he's like, uh-oh, and then there he goes. So Peter's out there on the water having a chat with Jesus, and all of a sudden it's like, wait a minute. He perceived what was happening, what he was doing. He saw the wind, it says. How do you see the wind when you're out on the water especially? Well, I'll tell you how you see the wind. You see the waves. Maybe he saw Jesus' luscious hair blowing. I don't know. He saw his surroundings. I think that's the point. He perceived. Now, the children's version of this is that he was walking out to Jesus, and he looked away from Jesus. He started looking at the water, and then he started sinking. That is not what this says. He walked all the way out to Jesus. But then, once he's out there to Jesus, he is starting to look at everything around, and he's becoming afraid again.
How far was it he walked out there?
We don't know. We don't know. I can't imagine it being that far, but it was far enough, Jesus was far enough out that they did not recognize him. So in these conditions, that wouldn't have to be necessarily as far as if it was a clear in the middle of the day. But it seems to me to have been a decent amount. I mean, maybe 100 feet. I don't know. It was far enough for them not to recognize him. Carl, what'd you say?
But it was called the Sea of Galilee. It's not Lake Shelbyville where 30 feet and you're at your shore again.
Yeah.
A sea is going to be something big. And if you've been on the Gulf of Mexico or the Atlantic Ocean, when those waves pick up, you're looking at 30, 40, 50 feet of waves.
Yeah.
And we're talking boisterous. We're not talking 2 feet whitecaps. We're talking massive.
Yeah, it was a...
Freak anybody out.
Yeah, it would. Even somebody that's just been given the ability to miraculously walk across, it's still the lesson for us, that what Matthew's actually recording, and the lesson for us altogether is he started to get distracted by his surroundings. Yeah, and we do that all the time. We might be having the best week or month or streak of faith and dedication and determination, and then all of a sudden something happens, and we get our tunnel vision ends, and we're like, now we snap out of it, and then it may take us a little while to get back. We start sinking, so to speak. Yeah, Dean.
This was a storm.
Mm-hmm.
And it was dark, it was getting close to getting light, but no, in the storm, it got dark and that, and, no matter how far it would have been, say you might have been just 10 feet away, but if it's dark, you're not gonna be hardly be able to recognize that individual. So I mean, regardless of how far it was, it could have been 10 feet, 20 feet, or farther, but the thing is, it was dark, and he saw the outline of where Jesus was. So, basically, and, like I say, once he got there,
Yeah.
Yeah, that's when it hits you sometimes after the fact. You're like, oh.
Yeah, and what happens here is, the thing that we might easily overlook is that Jesus knew that he was doubting. All he did was he saw the wind. He started to get, sort of overwhelmed by his surroundings, and immediately he started to sink. And, I don't think it was like quicksand necessarily. Like, oh no, I'm sinking in the water here. I mean, that's not how it works. It was probably like a dunk tank, when you throw the baseball or whatever at the thing, and it's like, even though it says beginning to sink, but, not beginning to sink below the surface, but, beginning to sink like a rock. You drop a rock in water and it begins to sink, it's already under the water. That's when it's starting to sink. So he was standing on the water, but now all of a sudden he's in the water, under the water. And because Jesus knew, or if we, at least we can say God knew, as a whole, but he cries out for Jesus to save him. And he immediately, just like he immediately spoke to them before, he immediately reaches out his hand and takes hold of him, but not without giving him a slap on the wrist, so to speak. He says, "Oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt?" See, what did Peter do? He doubted. That was what he did wrong. He doubted. Before he was certain that this was Jesus, he walked out there. Now that he's with Jesus, he knows it's Jesus, somehow it's whenever he doubted. It's strange how that works, isn't it? But Peter's human. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that's when it changes. No, I can't. I've taken my eye off of who can.
Yeah. Taking my mind even, he started thinking about Peter and the wind and the water. And Jesus taught him a little lesson here.
If you doubt, you can bam right there, ready to suck you down in the water.
Yep, doubt can work pretty quick. Doubt works in a bad way. Well, when they got in the boat, like the flick of a switch, the storm's over. Not for the first time. It just ends.
And this wasn't a lesson just for Peter. I think also was a lesson for the other apostles.
Yep.
Because they all, when they were all really in the same condition that Peter was. Because they were afraid, but they didn't stop Peter. Peter was the only one.
Yeah.
Were they still afraid or not? I don't know. But we know that their faith, just like here with Peter now, they lacked their faith in the phone. And yet they all doubted that Jesus was Jesus. So, all is a lesson not only for Peter, I think also for the other apostles, knowing that, they all were in the same boat, so to speak.
Yeah.
In the same ship. So they,
Literally and figuratively, yeah.
all just as guilty as Peter.
Mm-hmm. Tice?
I think it's also it's important not to overlook that when Peter was sinking, it doesn't say that he began to sink and Jesus reached out and immediately grabbed him.
Mm-hmm.
He called out to him and said, "Save me."
Yeah, Lord, save me. So that was all it took. It snapped him out of, first he got snapped out of what he was doing, and now he got snapped out of his doubt. And he's back focused on Jesus because he needs help. And Jesus is the one that can help.
He didn't just save him though, like we can't just expect Jesus, like we have to ask for it and do something for it.
Yeah. And, he rebuked him. I mean, that's a rebuke. If there ever was a rebuke, that's a rebuke. It was a gentle rebuke, I would say. More gentle than some times when he rebuked Peter. Yep.
And two, there's other ways that Jesus could have responded to Jesus. He didn't have to reach out to him and grab him. He
Yeah.
But here we see that the closeness that he was, that maybe it was the assurance to Peter to have somebody that close as he is,
Mm-hmm.
and to have, he took that day, he recognized he wanted to. If he did, he went and got that
Yep.
personal contact, and that the contact that he had with Jesus.
Yep. There's nobody else in the whole world that could have saved Peter from that situation but Jesus. And that's similar, exactly, actually, to spiritual salvation today. Only Jesus. Which Peter would later preach. There's no other name in heaven among men that by which we must be saved. Salvation in no other. The lesson was learned from the others, because whenever they got back into the boat and the wind ceased, those in the boat worshipped him and said, "Truly, you are the Son of God." So they learned the lesson. So it's one thing for Jesus to do these amazing things, but whenever you make somebody else do it, it's even more impressive, I think, because, we talk about magicians and stuff. They're able to do pretty impressive things, but they're not going to be able to make you do it. They may do all kinds of tricks, like that looks like they're levitating, or all these crazy stunts or whatever. But they can't make you do that thing. But Jesus made Peter do it, and they learned another. Everything that ends up happening is just another example of His power. All right, very quickly. The next lesson then is another boldness / slump in Peter's life. He, as we saw in this context, was often the spokesman for the disciples. I don't know if they chose him to be that. Probably not, if I was going to say. He just took it upon himself to do that. And his words seem to have always been sincere, and they were never dishonest. Maybe to a fault, as some people would say. I wouldn't agree with that, but he's honest to a fault. I don't think there's such a thing as that, other than maybe you could just say nothing. You don't have to say everything. It's not a lie to not say something necessarily. But on one occasion, Jesus told them they were going to be scattered from Him. This is John 13. They were going to be scattered. They were going to leave. And then He tells Peter says, I'll never do that. Never. These guys might. And I can't imagine, if the others heard, I can't imagine that going over too well. When you that's a step too far, really. They might leave you, because Jesus said, you're all going to leave me and be scattered. Peter says, I won't. They might, but I won't. I'll die with you. And Jesus said, let me tell you something, Peter. You talk a big talk, okay? But before the rooster crows, you're going to deny me 3 times. And he couldn't accept that. He said, no way. You know why Peter said there's no way on earth I would do it? Because he truly, in his heart, knew that would never happen. There's nothing that could ever happen that would make him do that. Now, fast forward to the Garden of Gethsemane. Well, before this right here. And another part of, giving Peter credit where credit's due, it's a very strange sort of credit. But if you remember, we kind of jump on Peter for being the one. John rats him out as the one who drew his sword. The others just say one of the disciples drew his sword and cut off the high priest's servant's ear. Well, Peter is the one that did that. And you know what he was doing when he did that? Even though he was disobeying Jesus, you know what he was doing? He was proving what he said. He said, I will die for you, I'll fight, I will not leave you. So here Jesus is getting arrested, and Peter backs up his word. He did it in a very foolish way. He did it when he shouldn't have. But he did try to prove what he said, back up what he said he would do. But that was not what Jesus wanted him to do and what he told him not to do. But then later on, even after he did scatter, he's in the courtyard there, hanging out by the fire, and he starts to get recognized. This girl recognizes him and says, "Hey, I know you. You're one of them. You're with him, the guy up there that's getting tried, mockingly." And Peter says, "I don't know what you're talking about." Got the wrong guy. It's not me. It was some other Galilean fisherman named Simon Peter from Capernaum. It wasn't me. Well, fast forward a little bit later, somebody else notices him. Says, "Hey, aren't you one of his disciples?" "We know you are because we heard you talk and it gave you away." Happens to Tabby all the time around here. Apparently it doesn't with me. Nobody ever says it to me, but I'm not as attractive, I guess, and so people don't talk to me. But yeah, they said, we hear you speak. We know you're from Galilee. No way you're getting you're getting away with without people noticing that you're from Galilee. Well, he says, "I don't know what you're talking about." Again, and then finally a third time, they recognize him, and each time it gets heavier and heavier, and he starts to, according to the ESV, invoking a curse on himself and swearing. "I do not know that man." And then the rooster crows. But the good side of this story is that later Jesus gives him another chance. So for the 3 times that he denied Jesus, even though he said he wouldn't, that was probably the most humbling part, is that he said, I would never do it, and then he did it. And he just could not believe that he actually did it. But now Jesus gives him a chance to take it back, as it were, and he does that. He asked him, "Do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me?" And he said, "Yes, Lord, you know I love you." And from that point on, Peter was a totally different man, especially after the day of Pentecost. So we can learn a lot of things from Peter. We can learn a lot of things of what not to do from Peter. We can learn a lot of things of what to do. But his faith is unmistakable. Even when it was ignorant, even when he went out of line, his faith prevailed in the end with the Lord's help. And we need to do what he did and look to the Lord, and so he can help our faith prevail as well.